No, I think that I'll have to stand on my previous statement. Yes, ma'am.
Does your administration plan to take any steps to solve the problem at Fayette County, Tennessee, where tennis farmers have been evicted from their homes because they voted last November and must now live in tents?
We are, the Congress, of course, enacted legislation which placed very clear responsibility on the executive branch to protect the right of voting. I supported that legislation. I am extremely interested in making sure that every American is given the right to cast his vote without prejudice to his rights as a citizen. And therefore, I can state that this administration will pursue the problem of providing that protection with all vigor.
Mr. President?
Yes.
The tents did not have floors in them, and when the winter set in, then the ground got wet with rain and muddy.
Conditions were bad there. And when you've been around the ground floor, when it thawed up, it was disaster.
She was telling her about how sick her children became. She thought anything could happen to her children.
And it's only after I become a professional and I start digging into the history that I discover what actually transpired. I never even thought about, that they had voted, prior to this particular movement in the late 1950s. In fact, I just assumed that slavery ended and segregation was introduced.
1865 and the subsequent years, called the Reconstruction era, brought great hopes to Black Americans. 1865 saw the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, brought about by ratification of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and the Reconstruction Act, which protected the rights of newly freed slaves and divided the South into 5 military districts. These acts required that the ex-Confederate states either ratify state constitutions conferring citizenship rights on blacks or lose their representation in Congress. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, made citizens of all those born or naturalized in the United States, most notably former slaves. The 14th Amendment also stripped many former Confederates of their right to vote. The 15th Amendment in 1870 forbade the denial or abridgment of the right to vote and gave Congress the power to enforce that law. In 1870, Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first black member elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. That same year, Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. Senator. Between 1870 and 1899, 20 blacks would be elected to the United States House of Representatives, and 2 blacks would be elected United States Senators, all Republicans, the party of Lincoln. In 1876, a close presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden resulted in the Compromise of 1877, which marked the end of Reconstruction. The compromise required withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Their removal meant abandoning the enforcement of racial equality in the South and brought about an era of terror aimed at suppressing the rights of black citizens that lasted nearly 90 years. Thus began the period historians call redemption, more commonly known as the Jim Crow era. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court sanctified segregation and Jim Crow in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which affirmed the doctrine of separate but equal. The last black congressman from the Reconstruction-era South, George W. White of North Carolina, left office in 1901. It would be 72 years before another black congressman from the South held office.
The people themselves become fed up with the situation in those respective counties. If you look at the leadership in those counties, it was men who had returned from World War II who came back with what I call a new attitude and a new perception about themselves and their role and the role of blacks or African Americans in that particular place and space at that time.
Race relations began to change dramatically after World War II. Black veterans returned after fighting for freedom and democracy in Europe and the Pacific to face the bitter reality of white supremacy at home. Black veterans of the Korean War returned home from the first fully integrated military to Jim Crow segregation at home. These veterans would form the vanguard of the modern civil rights movement. Among them were civil rights icons Medgar Evers, James Meredith, and Whitney Young. And in West Tennessee, among the returning World War II veterans were Hartman Jamison and John McFerrin from Fayette County, and J.F. Estes, an attorney from Memphis. In 1959, these three would form the Fayette County Civic and Welfare League to help blacks gain their full rights as American citizens. Estes would go on to assist in the formation of the Haywood County Civic and Welfare League.
We had to wait till all the whites get in the car. We were soldiers in a train, and we could get in the train, but we had to sleep back there with the chickens. And we slept back there with the chickens, and we got up in Crown Point. I was living in Gary. We got in Crown Point, Indiana, and the man told the conductor to slow the train down, but they couldn't stop with no stopping station. We had to jump off that train while it was running in that snow up to here.
I was drafted right after I come 18 years old. I come 18 in February, and it was a draft going off where we all who was farming got to prefer the farm, which was to, I think it was 6 months. And the 8th of November, they called all of the boys who were farming, the men in, and drafted us into service.
he was dissatisfied with a lot of things as they were here at home after he came back. And one of the things, he was always concerned about the culture of Afro-Americans.
We had a 50-acre farm where my father was, like I said, my boss mate. And I hadn't experienced all of this, if it was Jim Crowism or whatever, before I went to school. I didn't really know. It was not taught to me, and I didn't really know how deep it was embedded and how much it exists. And it was a kind of a way of life, so I thought I had a right to vote. And when I came back, I found out that people were not voting, and I was very interested after Mr. McPherson got into this and started making a move. And I really thought the reason we didn't have was because we didn't seek to make changes, and I didn't realize it was such a taboo thing.
And he complained of meeting some people, this was in Mississippi, that he said didn't seem like they were, just didn't seem like they were very well cultured at all. He said they looked as if they were afraid of other people. And this was in an area where he was cutting logs. And he was so disturbed at how those people were that he refused to go back down there to finish that job. So from there on, I noticed he would watch television a lot, and he would watch a lot of uprising and dissension of poor people that were in protest for better conditions. And it just seemed like it was on his mind that it was just, at that time, he had seen some things different and he wanted to do something about it.
The right to vote, the right to fulfill a role that gives individuals a voice in their government. That had been stripped away. When you look at those two counties, the way that issue came about, it was not so much about the right to vote as it was about serving on a jury. Because there was a man by the name of Dotson who had been convicted of a crime, allegedly the murder of a sheriff or sheriff's deputy, I believe. And the people in the county was interested in him receiving a fair trial. So it was really an issue about representation in the jury pool that led to the issue of voting rights.
In 1959, this was like in the early spring, it was, the news got around that Burton Dotson was going to be brought back to Fayette County to stand trial for murdering a white man.
They got Dotson out of the car, and he was handcuffed with his hands behind him. And we heard he was 76 years old. So they drug him out the car and stood him up on the street. Well, he couldn't stand alone with them handcuffs behind him. They had to kind of hold on to him to stand him on the street.
They noticed that when the jury was seated, that the jury was all white. And they became very disturbed about that because they felt that Mr. Dotson wouldn't have a chance at all with that all-white jury. So as it went on, Mr. Dotson he was indicted, and in fact, he was sentenced during this trial and sent off to jail. But in the meantime, they asked Attorney James F. Estes that represented Mr. Dotson, why wasn't black people on the jury?
Well, we wanted to be on the jury. So we come to find out after we talked with Estes at 12 o'clock, you had to be arrested to be on jury.
None of the blacks were at that time allowed to vote.
Shelby County, Memphis itself, Shelby County is closer, but Memphis itself is 40 miles away. And as a child, when I learned that black people could vote in Memphis, but 40 miles out in Haywood County, I had no political rights at all.
I went and sat in some days at the trial a while, but Harbin John had more time out at the store They went every day. And that's when they started about the people couldn't get nobody, no black on the poll, didn't have no black registered vote. They had to be registered vote to be on the jury.
Attorney Estes told them that the reason there were no black people on the jury was because black people were not registered to vote here in Fayette County. So they got it in their mind then that they wanted to see that changed.
We got interested in it. We wanted to be on jury.
They talked to Attorney Estes and asked him how should they go about setting up an organization to work through. And then shortly after that, that's when the Fayette County Civic and Welfare League came into being.
And that trial opened a lot of black people's eyes, and they're starting to think and do some things.
The research will show that when you're dealing with the movement, a lot of these issues are coming from the bottom up, and they're coming from the people themselves.
The power structure became upset about black people registering to vote, and we couldn't get people registered very easily. There were days when there would be from 400 to 800 people in line at the courthouse to register to vote. We were only permitted to register on the first Wednesday of each month. But many times when you go up to register, there would be signs on the door that the register is out today, the register is out with mumps, or the register is out with measles, or the registrar is sick. It was just always something going on with the registrar.
When I registered to vote, it was open. In other words, I was not with the masses. If there was a thing that said, I guess they considered me with the classes, it was not a movement in that. But once I found out what had happened after I registered to vote, sure, I started convincing and converting people about that they should go register.
There were times when these huge numbers of African Americans would be outside, standing in line in the cold weather. Then when hot weather came, they were standing outside in the heat. A lot of them would become overcome from the high temperatures. And there would be times when white people standing on the second floor of the courthouse would sprinkle powdered red pepper down on the crowd of people. And these people were doing nothing. They were just standing there orderly, just orderly. But there were these white people that they even deputized extra people to stand guard over these black people who were there only to register and vote.
We didn't have but one day a month to register. And then after I got registered in July, they began to move the registration place. Some of the people we asked to, would they, vote, would they register where they could vote with us. And when they started to come to around the courthouse, started asking about where was the registration at, we had a nice bunch walking around, said Hatchet Bottom. Said the last Negro they hung him over Hatchet Bottom.
I was in the first batch that we were later labeled, that once we started knowing what was going on, we were going around to different churches, cotton fields and everywhere promoting this function. We found out there was a black list that started, and by the name from each division, or we have a civil district. I was from District 15. They would put the names in, and they would label besides the name, would put an A by it, which I understand was supposed to be for agitators. And yes, I was one of the original agitators as identified.
And when we decided we wanted to register and vote, why was there so many obstacles placed against us? Why did the merchants stop selling us food?
I went to the store one day and the man told me, he said, I went to pick my groceries. He told me, he said, well, I got the groceries, I could stop at the counter. He met me before I got to the counter. I told her, I can't say you're no grocery person, but if your name's on the black list, you can go get somebody that ain't registered and vote, come here and get your groceries. Well, I just left the bed sitting on the floor and went out. And I said, I can't get nobody to go in there, spend my money for me. I didn't go back.
I had the same problem so far as getting groceries. I couldn't buy groceries or gasoline from merchants here, even with money. There were a time or two that I had to even get some canned milk. When my daughter was born in 1957, and we'd have to get someone who hadn't registered, maybe if it was to get a couple of cans, but we'd go out of town and buy the case, maybe over in Hardeman or in Shelby.
I was substitute teaching, and I was buying my gas on time until payday. This merchant, this store where I was buying my gas, this white man, he seemed to have been a respectable, kind man, but I believe pressure was placed on him. So one morning he came out and told me that I can no longer let you have gas.
Not only that, there were known letters that were written. We produced copies of that from insurance agency where car insurance was canceled, house insurance was canceled.
You couldn't, I had a gas stove, my butane tank, they took it, my insurance was canceled. They pulled everything except your light bill, they didn't bother that.
I was stop being called to sub. The pressure went that high, and I was subbing and going to school. I hoped to have completed my college work, but no, this person who was over calling the subs stopped calling me.
We were to be made an example of. You know, so other blacks would probably say, well, I can't do that. You see what happened to Yancey.
Oh, my father and brother, everybody that was registered to vote was on the black list.
We got on the black list, and we got it copied, and it was turned over, got in the hands of the FBI. And of course, even then I was called in to the FBI to identify the fact, to verify whether this was the list, because I had to describe everything to him before he pulled it up. And I told them they were getting paid to do it. They hadn't got it done in Fayette County, and we didn't appreciate doing the work for the FBI, what they were getting paid to do.
I'd gone down to the office to do some work, and I observed that there were 2 or 3 lawyers working on a number of FBI reports, probably a stack of FBI reports, maybe 8 or 10 inches high. And I learned that they were reports with respect to reporting on allegations of discrimination in Haywood County. And I offered to take some of those reports and review them with with the lawyers that were doing the work. And we quickly saw that there were all sorts of charges of discrimination against blacks who had tried to register to vote in Haywood County.
Back in that day, you had an agreement when a rent note would come up, and you had to be by middle of August, you had to be of the year for, you're gonna stay there that year, for the next year you had to move.
You had a lifetime home on this farm with these people if you were a good good, nice people, but you were not supposed to register and vote or anything like that.
I read 1959 in June.
I didn't get quite with the, well, it wasn't registered, but one day a month. So that was, I think, John and some more of the men around the store up there, they got registered that Monday in June.
In the middle of December, some people come down and look at the house, and I said, tell myself, what's going on? And I went and asked the people, they told me they had rented out to somebody else, middle of December. So I had to move.
I was afraid for my father and my mother. As I said, my mother went after my father went to register to vote. He wasn't unaware of the consequences, but if he felt that it could be done, then he would do it.
And Mr. Sammy told him that he had to move because that he had found out he had registered to vote. And my daddy couldn't say anything.
Sure enough, he registered, and within about 2 or 3 weeks, we were gone. We were evicted.
A few days after that, we moved over into the house on Winfield Lane.
It was a shack. If you'd walk into the place, you can look down at the floor and you see the cracks, the spaces you'd see under the house. If you look along the walls, you see sunlight coming in along the walls. And it was like, oh my God, I walked in there and I thought, we can't live here. This is not a house. We're gonna freeze.
Mr. Sammy told him that he wasn't doing this on his own. He said the other people around there, other white people around there was getting on him because he had a man on his farm that had registered to vote. And that wasn't about to be happening at that time.
They didn't tell me. I went and asked them after these folks come look at the house. They said, yeah, we out here registering votes. We decided to let somebody else have it. I said, that's fine. I said, it's your land. You can do what you want with it. I got to the 15th of January to get out. She said, yeah. And I said, I'll be gone by that time. And I was.
When they registered to vote, they lost their lifetime status, and those people had to move just because they registered to vote.
Unless you had relatives like my father did, you know, you was just out there.
Mr. Shepard was a very generous man. He was a very kind man. He was just very accommodating. And when the Civic League approached him, asking him if he would allow tents to be set up on his farm because people were being evicted and they didn't have any place to go and no shelter, and he agreed.
Well, the people didn't have anywhere to go. They had asked several people, you know, black farmers, that would they put tents on their farm. They were afraid to, but he said, he just said, I can't stand to see those people outdoors, and he decided they could come on the farm.
It wasn't very long before there were approximately, it was more than 200 people. It was something like 222 people that lived in the tents that were on Mr. Shepard's farm.
When this first started setting up the tent city, people were moving in from various areas, kind of where they couldn't find anywhere to stay with relatives, and it was set up first just on just ground that with no cover, any footing or anything to it, just like it was just mud, so to speak, if it rained or whatnot.
And we had heard of the people in Fayette County going into a tent, and I thought this might not be much, but apparently it's better than a tent, because I used to think, what do they have for a floor in a tent? I really didn't know.
Tents were small for the beginning. A little bit later on, we did get some other tents that were larger, but the tents was quite small, and many of those families were of young couples, and they had quite a few young children that had to also be housed in the tent. And the tents did not have floors in them, and they were just out there on the farm, on farmland. And when the winter set in, then the ground got wet with rain and muddy, and the people were, many of them were just in mud inside of the tents. They were just in mud.
Conditions were bad there. Muddy, sloppy. When you've been around the ground floor, when it thawed up, it was disaster.
But they would go out, they would break straw from the fields, put down on the inside of the tents. They would also take old bedspreads, old quilts, pieces of carpet, wherever they could find a piece of carpet, and spread down on the floor, trying to hold the mud back where they would not just be standing in mud.
It's Pete Seeger's song said, they kept us from voting for nearly 100 years, all because our color is not the same as theirs. But now we have gone and voted, and we live in tents today. Our families cold and hungry, but this is what we say. We were born in Fayette County, and here we will stay, and we will see the coming of a new, brighter day.
Dorr's use of the 1957 Civil Rights Act gave him an opportunity to go in and use that act. You know, most historians, you know, say the act wasn't very strong, but it was strong enough for him to go in, look at it, and litigate cases based on what municipalities and county governments were or were not doing.
I believe that on the first occasion that when I went into Haywood County and met Curry Boyd, the person who had written to Justice Department about some of the incidents that had happened to blacks who had attempted to register to vote, I asked Mr. Boyd if I could meet some of the blacks who had had these experiences. And we went down a rural country road, gravel road, and came to this church that was just set on cement blocks at the four corners of the church. And I walked to the front of the church, and then I saw their faces, and they were very attentive, and I said to them that my name was John Dorr, that I was from the Justice Department, and that I had come down to help them because of the problems they'd had because they tried to register to vote. And it wasn't very long into the conversation that I said, how many of you have been asked to get off, have been told you have to get off your land as sharecroppers because you tried to register? And every single person in the room raised their hand. These black farmers had done anything wrong except tried to register to vote. And they, all of them, had been on the farms of their landlords for many years. When I say all of them, that's probably, and maybe some of them were only tenants for 2 or 3 years, but many of them were tenants for 20, 25 years. And they all had families. They were all poor. The only thing they knew was how to farm cotton on shares, and to be required to get off the land at the only place they lived and go somewhere else was really a cruel thing to have that happen to them. And it was at that moment, I suppose, that I resolved that I was going to try to do something to help those people. The last thing that the district judge wanted to have before him was a case brought by the United States government against 50 or 60 white citizens of Haywood County claiming that they discriminated with respect to voting, and if the judge got just a complaint and the bare allegations of a complaint, it might not upset him so much. But if you gave him a preliminary motion for a preliminary injunction with 28 or 35 affidavits of black citizens, if you then attach to those affidavits letters that white citizens had written to the blacks telling them to get off the land at the end of the year, and if you had pictures of the black families who were being evicted, you had a pretty good package to give to the federal court.
I, Daley Walker, being first duly sworn, say, I am 50 years old. I reside in Silver District number 6 in Haywood County, Tennessee. I have lived on Mr. Sammy King's farm for 5 years as a sharecropper on the third base.
I have been on the farm for 16 years.
I've lived in a tenant house on the farm of Dixie Davis for 25 years. During that time, I have had a crop every year. 5 of the children are in school. 14 members of my family live with me in the tenant house. While I was standing in line to register, Mr. King saw me in line twice.
He told me that I shouldn't register. I told him that a man was a man regardless of his color.
On June the 7th, Mr. Leroy Gillespie met me in the road up by my place. He said, I would advise you not to register.
He asked me if anyone had talked to me about registering. I was one of the first ones to register. I finally registered on August 11th, 1960.
I registered to vote in Haywood County on June the 6th, 1960. I've already registered. He said, well then, I will tell you, just like I told JW, you will have to hunt yourself a house. After I registered, Mr. Rainey told me I was going to get my credit cut off. I have looked for a place to live, but I haven't been able to find one yet.
To find you somewhere else to go. I have looked for a place in Haywood County, but I can't find one. I know I am going to have to move on January 1st because my place has been rented to another Negro who hasn't registered. His name is Ivory Jackson. My only income is from farming.
The Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy decision, which institutionalized segregation under the guise of separate but equal, brought about a system which was indeed separate and anything but equal. It heaped indignities upon black citizens by turning a blind eye to vastly inferior schools and public accommodations. It essentially created 2 classes of citizens, whites and everybody else. The rise of Jim Crow in the 20th century caused a marked increase in incidents of violence against black people, including beatings, torture, and murder. This system also brought about a corruption of the Southern justice system, whereby any black who was charged with a crime was inevitably convicted, but whites charged with crimes against blacks were generally found not guilty. A particularly vivid example of lynching and the corrupt white judicial system was the notorious murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in Mississippi. He was tortured and drowned by 2 white men in 1955. Both men were acquitted by an all-white jury. Between 1882 and 1964, 3,445 black people were lynched.
The intimidation had been there. The history of people being beaten about things before what occurs in the late 1950s and so on. This whole business of maintaining the status quo and essentially maintaining whites in power.
When you start a movement, a mass movement like that, and we didn't see the necessity, I don't think, for non-violence, because when someone infringing on your right, it's a matter of survival, and whatever it takes. It's hard, like I said, it's hard to talk to a hungry man. I think is a dangerous man.
There were rumors, you know, about lynchings and that crosses were burned. I never saw a cross burned. I never saw anybody in a Ku Klux Klan outfit, you know, riding around Haywood County and so on. But there were rumors all the time that these things were going to exist, were going to occur. Now, what I suspect is that it was that level of fear, and the fear was based on that you take people who were in my parents' generation, they knew of people who were their grandparents and so on, who had been beaten or something like that. And I think it was that kind of fear that tended to operate.
And I know when we used to have those meetings, we took cautions. We used to go home different ways from where I live. I had 3 or 4 different ways I'd go home. And I'd always be traveling. I'd always be dressed. I'd have what I needed for where I would need to get back. And sometimes it'd be so tense, you think so tense. I recall one night in particular, I was sitting there in a small house, and my wife and children, they were small, were there in the bedrooms, kind of one of those sleepless nights. And I decided I had a large Masonic Bible. I said I'd read it, you know, I could sleep for a while. And I put it on the arm of the couch and stretched out a little bit with my gun in my hand, kind of long range. And some kind of way I moved around oddly, and this Bible fell off this couch, and it made such a loud noise. It sounded like almost like the roof was falling in. I guess because of being tense. But I'm saying, I was saying, we try to go prepared and at the same time be cautious.
There's plenty of guns already over there.
People were, you know, armed, but I think the thing was, and what posed a threat, was in terms of organized armed. Everybody, you know, in the country, because everybody hunted and so on, had guns and so on like that.
Early B, I had to move off of the land from Rushton, and he moved into the tent, and they were shot into his house, and he struck him in the arm somewhere, into this tent.
We were having a meeting tonight that Williams got shot in the tent, and we came down to the place. Mr. Toll was there that night. Mr. Vernon Toll's father, Mr. Shepard Toll.
When the next car come back through, that slowed down. They hit that car kind of hot.
And we were concerned about even going to, there's some problem maybe with the doctors. We weren't sure all the doctors working here. We didn't have any white doctors, so Mr. Williams was carried to Memphis to be treated for his wound. And I recall, I think we called UPI and AP and told them about it, but we couldn't give them the full story because they told them we had cell phones went out. But we had to rush to Memphis to get that taken care of, of course, and I didn't realize what an impact that would have, because when we got to the hospital, I noticed there were people coming in for different reasons, maybe who emergency room, but the press was already there waiting on Mr. Williams, and even before we got back to Summerville, 4 or 5 hours later, he was already on the Y service. With that shooting done, he had a lot of military, people who've been in the military, and I understand the retaliation came that, you know, you just go so far and then you can't go any farther, and tents, pup tents, like bivouac tents, were placed on each end where if they come through that area and do the wrong thing, it might could be answered on the other end.
Buck Grimm probably the best sheriff he had, you know, before this started. He said he was the best because he worked through all of this. I talked to him himself. I know him personally, and you know, had a lot of contact with him, really know it. He was a respectful man, he was nice. He said he worked day and night with my daddy and John and other white group. He said if white want to come out there and raid the store, that he worked dealing with them, told them, y'all may go up there, but a lot of y'all gonna get killed, and some of them may get killed, but they never come. I worked at the store at the time. I got threatened call all day, every day.
I think we never to go into the movement as nonviolent. I mean, had all respect for Dr. King, and we met in Atlanta Time School with John Lewis, and we had appointments set up with Dr. King, but this was not a, well, the movement may have started from a black minister action, Burton Dodson, because apparently it didn't appear that he was nonviolent either, but we were not being guided on by the ministers. We had a minister too, Reverend Dowder, and a couple of them in the community would come to the meetings, but in a situation like this, we had mostly, we sometimes call them suitcase ministers. They come out from Memphis and preach, and I don't know whether this would be aired, gather up their funds, go back to Memphis. So we didn't have many participating actually in the community other than for Sunday preaching and funerals. So it was a case where no one would object to violence if violence would erupt. And it was a good thing it didn't, because we had people who were not voters, who hadn't registered to vote, who were on the streets around Summerville, who were, I don't say substandard thinking, but they didn't start violence, but if they start, they would be, I would say they'd be in it. And these people have helped toward movements a number of times because, well, from the point, let's put it, because of poverty level and injustice, a lot of them be in jail on the weekend anyway. So to have a reason to go, a justified reason to go, didn't matter a lot. I had several when they was having the voting registered and voting on, have told us that we are supportive of you. We know what you're trying to do. We support you. We're here. They run in lines, and they were on the corners, and I have what I need in my old shoes, and if something happens, I'm in it because I like that kind of carrying on.
The federal lawsuit brought by John Doerr on behalf of the United States ended with the signing of a consent decree issued by the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, in a report summarizing the Justice Department's civil rights activity for 1961, wrote, "The department has also successfully obtained relief from the Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit to protect Negroes registering to vote in Haywood and Fayette counties, Tennessee, from economic reprisals through convictions and otherwise." The last of the families left the tent cities in 1962, some having been there for more than 3 years. When the consent decree was signed, only a tiny portion of eligible voters were registered. The elections of 1965 resulted in the first election of African Americans in Haywood County in the 20th century. In the summer of 1966, for the first time in the 20th century, black people were elected to office in Fayette County. A major legacy of the struggle for voting rights in Fayette and Haywood counties was the influence on the voting rights movement throughout the rest of the South, most particularly in Mississippi. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, one of the major civil rights organizations, used many of these tactics and strategies as a primary operational model. Freedom Summer in 1964, when scores of college students moved into rural black communities to organize voter registration drives, was directly inspired by the events of 1959 through 1962 in West Tennessee. The struggle for civil rights in Haywood and Fayette counties continued throughout the 1960s and 70s. The effort to register black voters is still ongoing today.
National civil rights leaders understood that if Fayette and Haywood counties failed, then it was going to be much more difficult to deal with the issues in Mississippi.
You take the situation with Senator Lott when he, this year, I mean, the consequences of what he did were very, very severe for him. And yet, if you compare some of the things that some of the senators in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana said and did in the 50s with no consequences, it's very different. It's not perfect, but it's different.
In November last year, I moved back here. And I only did it because it had improved a hell of a lot.
Southwest Elementary School, I'm principal there. I think I've been there about 20 years. I've been back in the county about that long. And this is my second, serving my second 4-year term as a county commissioner.
They were doing whatever they felt was right to do. And they didn't consider that we had rights too. So when we decided that we wanted to register and vote, they didn't want us to register and vote. And we decided that we were citizens of the county and the United States. Why couldn't we register and vote?
Yeah, we did it all ourselves. We didn't have no educated person. We just come up together. We never, I would say, goat raisers or some of the kind. And we didn't have no idea of hurting nobody. All we wanted to do was live.